Hello, welcome to How I Animate. This is one of 3 videos relating to this because I originally made this animation as one, but I think it makes more sense to split into 3 videos. So in this first part, I'll be teaching you how I animated this bouncing kind of motion. The title is true, I will be using Ibispaint, which isn't traditionally for animation. But the point is, you can just use your favorite art app if you're not using a pro animation program. And by the way, I am drawing on my phone with a tablet. So to start, my very basic understanding of how to make an animation is that you draw a point A and a point B and then draw however many points in between them to give an illusion of point A becoming point B when you put the frames together. There's a lot of things to consider in how to draw the other points to get from point A to point B. I don't understand everything obviously, so this tutorial is just what I know to consider and tips that help me with placing the lines from point A to B. Then in the end, I'll share the process to the full animation you saw in the start. To more conveniently talk about point A and point B and the points in between them, point A and B are your keyframes, the most extreme points of the motion, and each drawing will be a frame of the final animation. One thing to consider is the speed and acceleration of the motion. I find that typically motions follow an acceleration graph of something that looks like this, where it'll start slowly then speed up, and then it'll kind of slow down again in the end. For this animation here, it has 3 keyframes, so it's actually 2 sets of motions. Frame A to frame B follow a graph like this, frame B to C follows it also. But here's what happens if you choose some different graphs. On the left is what it might look like linear. The middle and right uses only half of the original graph between each keyframe. How I like to express the speed is to just draw the frames at different distances to each other. I think that way it also saves on frames to draw. A way for me to keep the distances between keyframes and in-between frames consistent is to decide on a fraction of how far along the way between your keyframes to draw. Because there are a lot of lines to your drawing, it's difficult to tell and make sure all the lines are moving at the same pace unless you kind of decide beforehand that maybe, for example, you'll want the first in-between frame to be a quarter of the way between your keyframes. Commonly, I use an eighth or a quarter. I also can't really accurately eyeball where a quarter point is from 2 lines. I'll show you my way to mark the 1/4 point with more accuracy between 2 corresponding points from both keyframes, and then you can just draw your line almost like connect the dots. This looks weird, but literally find 2 corresponding points from each of your keyframes and draw a line connecting them. With that line there, it helps me to visualize where the halfway point is. Mark that, then you can also find and mark the halfway point between there again, and then you've found where a quarter of the way is between there. Undo your lines and hashes and mark that with a dot, then you just do this with the other end of the line and connect the 2 dots you've marked. This is simple to do for straight lines, though I don't have a different way of doing it for circles or curved lines. Just mark as many points as you need to connect it. Another thing I often like to add in the end of a full movement is a little bounce back. It'll look like a bounce back, but how I do it actually is overshooting a frame over the blue keyframe, so it technically comes before the last keyframe as an in-between. This is pretty noticeable even with very minimal difference, so since it's such a small distance from the keyframe lines, I wouldn't really worry about measuring exactly how far to place it. Just think of it as being a little bit over the blue line while you are lining. There is also something that you might not want to line by following your distance fraction, and that's loose hanging strands. That would be the ends of the hair or maybe hoodie strings. I classify them as the things that aren't attached to the body at one of its ends. I'm not very good at physics, but it's like something about things and their inertia, and since it's not part of the main moving thing, that kind of gives it a delayed start. Kind of like when you're in a car and it changes speed abruptly, the hair you're animating should follow that too. And that was totally a very original example, by the way. I couldn't show this very clearly in my animation because I kind of made the mistake of not making this motion dramatic enough, which resulted in me not having very much space to show how the hair moves differently from the path of other lines. That's why I'm going to kind of remodel this out here. My simple kind of rule for this is to basically keep it closer to its original spot in terms of the direction it's traveling. That sounds very confusing, I think. The directional part is only so the hair doesn't seem so stretchy. So the root should just begin where it would normally, following your fraction. It's the point at the end that would not exactly be where your fraction would point to, because that's the part hanging loose. Usually it's more obvious to see the drag when it's traveling sideways than vertically, so that's the example animation I'll make. This strand is going to travel from the left to the right, and I'm going to draw 3 frames in between, and also a frame that kind of goes out further for a bounce back effect. First, I'll just plot the points where the strand is supposed to start. It would look kind of dead like this if everything was kept straight and consistent. I think it looks boring, so I'm showing you how I do it the fun way. For the first frame, I like to basically keep the horizontal value at the same place, but alter the points vertically because the strand has tilted. And since hair is not really rigid, you should also curve the strand a little bit overall. For the middle frame then, I usually just eyeball it to make it come forward a little bit, but also make sure it's obvious enough to not be close to the midpoint because it should be behind where the root position is. Then adjust to the tilt however it looks good, and also curve the strand more as a whole. Then by the third frame, the ends will have kind of caught up with the root. So in this frame, you would pretty much draw it how it would look, just following your fraction and not really taking the loose strand situation into consideration. I would recommend adding an extra overshooting frame for the hair because I think that adds more realistic points. In context of the line art for when you have the full body, simply duplicate the whole thing, but erase the hair parts you want to alter because you want to make it seem like everything else stayed the same. So start the root at the same place as the ending frame and draw it a little bit out away from the first keyframe. Curve that as it looks fit. And also a reminder that you can draw more frames if you want to for a smoother animation / a bigger motion. Like if you want to make it more like this. The 6 frames I did here are enough, I think, to do the job well and save on frames because drawing could take a long time. And that's the last thing I wanted to talk about going into making this animation today. So now I'll show the time lapse of the full process and kind of talk through that too. Thanks for listening to this video for so long. This was my first voiceover video. I hope I didn't traumatize anyone who wasn't expecting it. I'll say it now though that you can probably expect more talking videos. The first thing is to sketch out your keyframes. When doing the line art of the keyframes, try to make sure the keyframes have parts with the same proportion if that's how they're supposed to be. Meaning, for example, the size of the head doesn't just get bigger gradually into the next frame. If you can't really tell by looking, a thing you could try is to use the lasso tool and kind of rearrange the lines of your first frame onto the corresponding positions of your second frame. That way you can roughly see how big it's supposed to be when it shifts to where it'll end up. Between frames A and B, I just had 2 in between frames, since the distance is quite small, so 2 is enough to express the speed. The first in between would barely leave the red to be closer to the blue, and the second would be nearly at the blue. I didn't actually have a fraction I was going by for this one because of how small a lot of the distances were. I do wish I had made this animation more dramatic overall. line art process, when you finish each frame or small animation, I would save the frames and try to scroll the animation through your photos to see if it looks good so far. I drew 3 in between frames in total, between frames B and C, 2 kind of regular ones, and then 1 for a bounce back. I did apply the loose strand rules into the hair for this movement, but I'm not sure it's really noticeable. Otherwise, I lined these frames the same way as the last movement. Coloring with the brush a lot in single drawings, but this was a lot of frames to color all by hand, so I just used my bucket tool. Shading is really optional for me in animation. It's quite hard to try to do a lot, since with a lot of the brushes, the strokes come out varying in thickness. I did some minimal shading with just 2 blobs of hair highlights, blush, neck, ears, and eyes. And then you're kinda done. I hope the process was easy to understand. Thank you for watching this video. I had a lot of fun making it. Goodbye.